the US MSO, their underlying businesses have continued to strengthen. They continue to get more access to capital, and they continue to grow, and their stock prices have come down. So from a multiple perspective, they're a lot more attractive than they were at the beginning of the year or even a year ago. And that's going to obviously have an impact on some investors. And, you'll start to see some money flow in there. And then with any luck, we'll start to see, as we move towards the US midterm elections in next November, we'll start to see, some more talk of legislation. And at that point in time, maybe it looks like it's going to be put into legislation. And then, we'll start to see the stock prices move up in anticipation of that.
Bruce Campbell joins me now, portfolio manager of the StoneCastle Cannabis Growth Fund. Bruce, welcome back.
Yeah, thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, it's great to see you, Bruce. Bruce, let's start with today's news that Malta has become the first EU nation to legalize cannabis, and very much modeled on the Canadian system, whereby adults will be allowed to carry up to 7 grams and grow no more than 4 plants at home. Does this have any bearing or significance for the cannabis industry, in your opinion?
Well, it's like anything, right? It's a tide change, and when that happens, presumably it'll start to move other countries in the EU to change their legislation. It's not one of those things that happens overnight, but it's not unlike what we saw in Canada with the medical to recreational, or what we're seeing in the US right now as well.
Sure. So then, what in your view is the outlook for the cannabis industry for this year, and how do you reconcile that with the sort of dismal performance that has happened this year?
Yeah, well, I think it's probably fitting that you're sitting in a fish tank right now, because the whole sector's underwater, right? So that was really bad, wasn't it? So obviously the sector's been extremely challenging this year. We saw out of the gate, the first 3 months or 2.5 months of the year was really straight up. And that was all based on US legislation that we thought was going to happen. And then when it wasn't happening, stocks started to drift. We've had some issues with custodians. The stocks continued to drift. There was a sort of quick restart in November when it looked like legislation was going to be put in place. And then, they've sold off, and now they're under heavy tax loss selling. With the year, the way it's turned out with the markets, where, if you look at the S&P, NASDAQ, pretty much any index, it looks fairly strong, and they've been fairly strong. There's lots of people with winners. Obviously, they're looking at cannabis and harvesting their losses. And so, this probably continues right up until the end of tax loss selling. And then, at that point in time, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a bit of a bounce in cannabis. I don't think it's going to take off and roar like it did yet, but we could see a bit of a bounce, because, a lot of this stuff's been under pressure. At the same time, especially in the US MSO, their underlying businesses have continued to strengthen. They continue to get more access to capital, and they continue to grow, and their stock prices have come down. So from a multiple perspective, they're a lot more attractive than they were at the beginning of the year or even a year ago. And that's going to obviously have an impact on some investors. And, you'll start to see some money flow in there. And then with any luck, we'll start to see, as we move towards the US midterm elections in next November, we'll start to see, some more talk of legislation. And at that point in time, maybe it looks like it's going to be put into legislation. And then, we'll start to see the stock prices move up in anticipation of that.
Yeah. A lot of the sort of high-profile social media cannabis investors, they've been broadcasting this sort of sentiment that it doesn't matter what happens at the federal level anymore in the cannabis industry in the US, because the cannabis industry has evolved to operate as efficiently as possible under whatever restrictions happen. Yet, the share price performance in 2021 would suggest that, well, that's not necessarily the case. So, in your view, is there any sort of expectation that the 2022 rather, and a potential change in Congress is going to have any relevance to cannabis investors in terms of share price performance of American MSOs?
Yeah, there's obviously a few things kind of on the horizon there. One is that originally this was really any type of legalization change in legislation towards cannabis was really democratically pushed, and just recently there was a Republican that led sort of new legislation that came out, and that was kind of the first time that we really saw that. And the thought is now that the governments on both sides recognize the importance of cannabis for the general population, with the fact that over around 60% of the population is in favor of recreational, and it's over 90% in favor of medical. And so they think that that's going to probably be something that they want to stand up and take credit for, like we did it, here, elect us. So that's obviously something that can drive share price, and the anticipation of that happening and kind of the legislation potentially moving ahead, even if it stays where it is now. Yeah, I mean, it's probably ultimately it will end up being legalized. We know that that's going to be the case. It's just a function of when. And so if you're an MSO, you probably don't want it, because now they have access to capital. Like Curaleaf just did a bond deal this week where it was less than it was like 8.25%, which is fantastic, money. But they have access to capital. They probably don't want it to be legalized because it gives them a moat for a while. From share investor perspective, you obviously want it to be, because that's where you're going to start to get larger institutions. Now, to that point, one of the things that that the CSE has announced is that they're going to have a tier system now. So they're going to have a top tier where most of these cannabis companies would fall into, and the reporting requirements are a lot more strict. So it'd be closer to what you would expect on the TSX or NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange. And so potentially that could bring in more investors who have shied away because the CSE's rules up until now. So that's a potential that, after 60 days of comments, we could start to see that moving forward. And that's another thing that could potentially be, a change.
Yeah, interesting. Do you expect to see anything happen on the part of the Biden administration in terms of federal action in the cannabis space?
Well, I mean, that's what, if you look at the sort of the run up that we saw from a year ago to February of this year, that was really what that was all based around, was the thought that, Biden was going to come in. And then one of the things that they were going to do in the first 100 days was, look to changing the legislation on cannabis. And, obviously a lot's gone on since then. We've got a pandemic, we've got, now we're wrestling with all kinds of other issues, and that's always going to be the case, I guess. But it seems like it's taken a bit of a back burner. But who knows? That could all of a sudden change if they think we're going to try to win back. Right now the projection is that they're going to give up a bunch of seats in the midterm, and if they said, hey, we're really going to try to dig in and get some of those seats back, maybe cannabis is one of those things that they try to change to rally back and get those seats back that they are projected to lose.
Interesting. Okay, so has your sort of lineup of companies in the space changed at all in terms of favorite from most favorite to least favorite in terms of your holdings?
Yeah, not a whole lot. I mean, we still like the large MSOs. There's a few of them that are probably cheaper than others, and then we've got a few smaller companies that we own that we think are niche, that have a view on a specific state or a few states, and then we've got a few Canadian companies that we think are executing in a really challenging market, are executing well, and that's kind of how the portfolio is made up.
Yeah. What do you make of there's been a lot of sort of a lot of changes in the cannabis management as a result of, I'm just going to say unproven allegations at this point, in terms of things like, the involvement of organized crime in some cases, insider trading in other cases. And, it just sort of dawned on me recently that the cannabis industry in many respects remains a criminal enterprise, at least in terms of all of these things that seem to go on behind the scenes. I mean, you name it, the industry has been plagued with scandal. Do you think that we're getting closer towards more of a sanitization of the industry, in terms of like these just being natural growing pains of an industry emerging from the black market to the legal market?
Yeah, 100% agree that that's where we're headed. we're probably closer now than we ever have been. If you kind of go back in history and look at, kind of the pioneers in the sector from a public standpoint, a lot of them had some type of, kind of black gray market participation. A lot of them had, they were visionaries, so they didn't necessarily have the best past as far as, proven record of success. And there was a lot of money thrown at the sector in a real short period of time. And of course, that brings in a lot of bad actors in itself. And so you sort of throw all those conditions together, and it was really a recipe for kind of mismanagement and kind of the worst of the worst as far as people doing things they shouldn't be. That's certainly changing. If you look at sort of the top cannabis companies and how many times now several of them have guard changes at the top, which is quite interesting. And I think that the sector continues to get dressed up from a business corporate C-suite standpoint that we hadn't ever seen in the past. And I think that probably continues, especially considering the money that's still there in the sector, and that projections on where the sector will go both in Canada and the US.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, Bruce. Well, that's a great update as per usual. I thank you for your time again, and we'll talk to you in the new year. Have a great season, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, you too.
Bye for now.